Well, for one, the elected leaders in Africa have to behave like elected leaders. There is no way our elected leaders can act like gangs, They want to do everything they want to do. They destroy the opposition. They destroy the base of public dissent. They destroy the institutions of the rule of law. And therefore, we cannot stop military coups as long as we have people that are not happy with their government. People should be happy with their government because if governments can deliver on their promises on human development. Now, it's easy for young people in Africa to take up the barrel of a gun and fight and, of course, loot and destroy anything that they want, where they take the rule of the law into their hands, and then they become more satisfied. We see it in many parts of Africa. But the point is, good leaders wouldn't lead you into this position. I mean, you have this kind of anachronism between having the Western rule of law concept and also with the kind of challenge we have in this continent. Now, if people in South Africa would be allowed to destroy private business at will, then Africa will never develop. And therefore, if we're going to stop coup d'etats, the African Union should not just condemn the coup d'etat. It should condemn people who are going for a third term. It should condemn people who are abusing their own people, abusing the human rights of their own people. Some African leaders have to start doing that. But this is the club of presidents and prime ministers that are protecting themselves. And therefore, there is no way you can stop coup d'etat. As a matter of fact, it has become very fashionable now, since African leaders are very happy with what they have. I mean, Mali, we had several coups there. Niger, they just stopped another coup. So this is going to continue. And this will happen also in other countries which you don't even think of, frankly, very soon, where governments are abusing their own people, where economies are being shattered, where the international relations, the foundation of their international relations are being eroded to a point where countries are being looked at as parent states. In fact, the Western intellectuals have created words for African states: failed states, fragile states, collapsed states. And I don't think we can go on with this kind of stuff. And the military are the only organized part of society and which has enormous resources at its hands, will always be there tempted to take over government. Some of them in good faith. They might go in good faith and try to save the nation. But in other cases, it could be just pure greed and having a political power to be able to have the spoils of the state power. So the only way you can stop a coup d'etat and have the army to do its own normal business is, for one, I don't think African countries would need a big army. If that was the case, Nigeria with its huge army, which was very effective in stabilizing countries in the ECOWAS, cannot even protect its own citizens in Nigeria against Boko Haram and against bandits who are stealing people. So, one, why do you need a big army if you don't have an existential threat? Number two, what about community law enforcement? Where communities are involved in law enforcement, where police are under the control of civilians, where the army is under full control of civilians. So the only way to prevent the coup d'etats is a complex web of political, social, and economic activities you would undertake to be able to recommend taking individuals where the potential for a military coup exists. And therefore, African intellectuals need to design research protocols which would help us to achieve this in the long run.
Thank you for that. Another recommendation I will ask from you is, now let's look at the African Union, because of course it's very important for the whole of Africa. what would you recommend to the African Union as a strategy to reinforce rule of law across Africa? Because we are saying now that the reason there is coup in Guinea is because the guy that is there is trying to outsmart the rule. If he had played by the rule, the person that is coming to overthrow him will not have any justification for doing that, even though he might want to do that. How can African Union reinforce or maybe force the member state to obey their own rule, to play by the book, so that democracy and the rule of law can prevail in Africa? What are your recommendations?
Well, the first thing is the African Union leadership, especially the African Union Commission, must have the full acceptance of African leaders. Number two, it must have a great channel of communication with African leaders. African leaders cannot come and contradict the African Union chairperson every time that chairperson does anything. The second thing is the African Union, as a regional political organization, has to focus on issues of peace and security and political affairs. The African Union has economic affairs offices, it has even an environment and forestry agenda, it has all kinds of agendas. And we have international organizations under the United Nations, under the IMF, under the World Bank, under the African Development Bank that are just doing the same thing. So it has to focus on political issues. Number two, the kind of stuff that I was talking earlier, where you create a very strong African civil society and strong African investigative media is where their forte can come in, where they can establish the kind of research protocols needed in every country, whether there is an early warning of a potential coup d'etat in any country. Of course, this is not going to be interfering in the thin veneer of sovereignty that the African states claim, but it would be in the service of the same states that the African Union would give them. The way I see it now, the African Union Peace and Security Council comes to a meeting, they condemn everything, they say we have to scrap out that country out of the African Union, and there are no consequences for the country. Being a member of the AU doesn't give you any privilege or any prerogative in terms of investments, in terms of international relations. For the Security Council, what matters is that you are a member of the United Nations, and nothing short of that. So the African Union has to devise an intellectual system within which what are the cases that would drive military coups, for example, let's take in Sudan. And what are the objective conditions for this now? When they see people rioting against their governments in Sudan, when people were being killed and their bodies thrown into the Nile River, the African Union didn't say a word. So after the coup, they start saying, you are an illegitimate government. No, this is not the point. With al-Bashir, who's now wanted with the International Criminal Court, the African Union's main job was protecting that man. And the African Union's main job was to completely invalidate the International Criminal Court, saying that the ICC is only focusing on African leaders. So the African Union has to transform itself, and the current chairperson of the African Union has an opportunity to do that because he has been elected again, and therefore there is no third term for him. And therefore, he can be bold enough to transform the African Union into really serving the African people and not the African heads of state and governments.
Thank you very much, sir. Now, this is going to be the last question from you. Actually, it's going to be your final statement, the kind of recommendation on how to promote the rule of law in Africa, because that is what we think is going to work, because this is not a jungle. We don't need jungle justice. We need rule of law. That this is the rule for everyone. This is how it's going to work. We decide what we want, and we decide how to get it. We decide how we want to be governed as a people, and everybody must play according to the rule. How do we promote this kind of rule in Africa? It's your final statement. Thank you, sir.
Well, you know, the rule of law paradigm is a paradigm that have come in throughout age, especially with the birth of the Renaissance in Europe. And most African laws are actually copied either from the French law or from the English law. And that's a problem, because if people don't understand the law, they cannot respect it. And these are laws that have been parachuted into the African continent without the full knowledge of the African people. Some of them don't even recognize African traditions in their legal instruments. So the United Nations set up with Hernando de Soto, the Peruvian economist, and Martin Albright as co-chairs, what you call the United Nations High Commission on the Legal Empowerment of the Poor. This legal empowerment of the poor focused on 4 areas. And these areas are: 1, access to justice. Really, whatever kind of justice systems Africans had, Africa is a continent which is the birth of humanity. Africa has survived before donors, before NGOs, before colonialists, before governments even came. African communities were thriving communities. And therefore, the legal system, when you talk about access to justice, has to be based on the feelings, on the aspirations, on the values that Africans place on the legal codes that are being written, not just codes that are copied from the United Kingdom or codes copied from France. The genesis of legal documents in these countries, basically in the philosophy of law, jurisprudence, will tell you that legal regimes have to be reflective of the population they serve. But they don't. So that's one issue. The second thing is property rights. Many countries in Africa don't recognize the property rights of their own indigenous people, for example. One of my new books coming out is on indigenous people in Africa, which are about 50 million people. But their land is being given to investors. They build roads, highways, railways. They build parks in this place, and they don't take the people seriously. They don't recognize the people in the first place. So they're driven out. By building a dam, you're going to fill that dam with water, and therefore people will be displaced. Nobody cares. No government cares about this. So property rights is an issue where people will have the right to properties which are in line with national benefits. The third area is what you call labor rights, where people would get paid for the kind of service they would provide. And finally, the most important right is entrepreneurship rights. Not everybody has entrepreneurship rights. If we see some African regimes, their children are being taken to court in Europe and the United States for stealing money from their own country. At least we have one case which has seen the courts in Western capitals. So, but how do you create an entrepreneurial environment for Africans to be able to develop by themselves so that they can contribute to the national economy? I'll tell you, if we do any legal empowerment of the poor according to the 4 criteria I mentioned earlier, the government, the presidents we have today will not be there. And therefore they will be afraid to undertake this. And I have a suspicion that most of our presidents will try to keep the entire population illiterate for fear that education will transform the African young people like it's doing now, because all of them are joining social media and creating new awareness, and they become a kind of a burden to the existing status quo of governments. And therefore, it's not a question of having a rule of law that we don't know, but it's a question of crafting a rule of law that Africans understand and would obey. Because if people don't obey any law, it's not a law anymore. You have to scrap it. And therefore, these are important issues that we need probably to raise in a much more broader discussion at another date. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.